Education is the key to success. It has brought us light, transport, new discoveries. Through education, we find a free...
Malcolm-Jamal's final message before his death changes everything. Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't say goodbye. He didn't announce anything. He didn't ask for attention. Instead, he left behind a message so quiet that almost no one noticed it at first. For most of the world, the news came suddenly. One moment he was alive, vacationing, creating, speaking thoughtfully as he always had. The next, headlines said he was gone, taken by the ocean during a family trip to Costa Rica. A tragic accident, they said. Case closed. But the more you look at the timing, the harder it is to shake the feeling that something doesn't sit right. Just days before his death, Warner shared one of the most honest conversations of his life. Not as an actor, not as Theo Huxtable, but as a man reflecting on pain, identity, survival, and what it really means to matter in a world that profits from misunderstanding you. At the time, it barely made a ripple. Now, it feels impossible to ignore. Tonight, we're not just looking at how Malcolm-Jamal Warner died. We're looking at what he said before he did, and why it sounds less like a reflection and more like a final message no one was ready to hear. When the news first broke, it felt unreal in the way certain losses always do. Malcolm-Jamal Warner, gone. The name alone carried decades of memory, warmth, and familiarity. For millions of people, he wasn't just an actor, he was a constant. Someone who grew up alongside them, week after week, inside their living rooms. At 54 years old, Warner was reported to have drowned while vacationing with his family off the coast of Costa Rica. Authorities called it a tragic accident. Strong currents, a routine swim that turned deadly. On paper, it was simple. Too simple. Because almost immediately, the details began to shift. Initial reports claimed he had been rescued by people on the beach. Later, that account changed. Emergency responders said they found him without vital signs. The timeline felt unclear, the information incomplete. And while none of this automatically meant something sinister, it left a quiet unease in its wake, the kind that lingers when a story closes too quickly. But what truly unsettled people wasn't just how Malcolm-Jamal Warner died, it was when. Just 2 days before his death, Warner released what would become the final episode of his podcast. At the time, it didn't feel like a farewell. It felt thoughtful, reflective, honest in a way he had increasingly allowed himself to be. But listening now, knowing what came next, the words land differently. Not dramatic, not desperate, just heavy. He spoke about identity, about survival, about what it means to exist in a system that benefits from misunderstanding you. He questioned narratives that reduce complex lives into marketable stereotypes. And he asked something that now feels impossible to ignore. What happens to a people who eventually begin to accept the labels placed on them by those who profit from their confinement? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't sensational. It was quiet. And that's why it passed unnoticed. Until it didn't. For most of his life, Malcolm-Jamal Warner existed inside a carefully preserved image. Theodore Huxtable, Theo, the awkward, good-hearted son on one of the most influential sitcoms in television history. On The Cosby Show, Theo wasn't perfect. He struggled with school, with confidence, with expectations. And that imperfection is what made him real. For an entire generation, Theo Huxtable represented something rare at the time. A young black boy allowed to be vulnerable, unsure, and still deeply loved. The show offered an image of family that felt aspirational without being unattainable. And Warner carried that sincerity with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. But what the audience saw was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, Warner grew up fast. Fame arrived early, and with it came pressure most teenagers never face. Expectations to stay clean, to stay likable, to stay relevant. The industry is littered with former child stars who weren't able to survive that transition. Warner knew that, And from a young age, he made a quiet decision. He would not unravel publicly. Instead of rebelling, he withdrew just enough to protect himself. When The Cosby Show ended, Warner didn't chase attention. He didn't lean into nostalgia. In fact, for a time, he admitted he hated being called Theo, not out of arrogance, but necessity. He understood that if he didn't redefine himself, the world never would. So he rebuilt, slowly, intentionally. He acted, but selectively. He directed episodes of television. He pursued music and spoken word. He wrote. He studied. He earned a Grammy for traditional R&B and later received another nomination for spoken word poetry. None of it flashy, none of it forced, just steady work. That discipline didn't come from nowhere. Warner often credited his mother, who managed his early career and insisted on structure, accountability, and boundaries. Even in the late 1980s, when excess was celebrated, Warner was writing a book for young fans about staying grounded, avoiding drugs, and making smart choices. At a time when many child stars were spiraling, he was advising others to stay steady. And he did. But stability doesn't mean the absence of pain. Some of the most defining moments of Malcolm-Jamal Warner's life came quietly, away from cameras. One of the deepest losses came in the late 1990s. Warner had been romantically involved with Michelle Thomas, his former co-star who played Theo's on-screen girlfriend. Though their relationship had ended, they remained close. In 1997, Thomas was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive stomach cancer. She died a year later at just 30 years old. Warner was reportedly by her side near the end. He never turned her death into spectacle. He didn't give interviews. He didn't seek sympathy. He carried the grief privately. Those close to him later suggested that loss changed him, made him quieter, more reflective, more intentional about love and time. Years later, Warner experienced a very different kind of heartbreak, one that unfolded in public. His relationship with Regina King, a fellow actor he had known since their teenage years, ended abruptly after 2 years. What should have remained private became tabloid material. The contrast between his guarded nature and the public appetite for details only reinforced a lesson he had already learned. After that, he drew a firm line. From that point on, Warner became fiercely protective of his personal life. Relationships stayed private. Family stayed unnamed. When the public later learned he was married and a father, it came as a surprise. Not because he was secretive, but because he believed some things deserved to exist outside consumption. That belief extended into his work. As he matured, Warner's creative focus shifted. Less about personal success, more about collective reflection. His spoken word albums tackled mass incarceration, racism, erasure, and identity. His short films explored unheard voices. His podcast created space for conversations that didn't fit neatly into Hollywood branding. And he did all of this without preaching. That restraint defined him, which is why the most painful controversy of his career wasn't of his own making. It came through his connection to Bill Cosby. Cosby hadn't just cast Warner, he had chosen him at 13 years old. On set, Cosby was mentor and father figure. Warner often spoke about lessons he learned during those years, about professionalism, discipline, and longevity. Advice that later proved true when he watched the show with his own daughter. When allegations against Cosby surfaced, Warner was placed in an impossible position. More than 50 women came forward. The accusations were devastating, and Warner didn't deny them. He acknowledged the pain. He expressed empathy for the victims. But he also admitted how difficult it was to reconcile those accusations with the man who had shaped his early life. "I can't defend him," Warner said, "but I won't throw him under the bus either." It wasn't evasion, it was honesty. He also criticized the media spectacle surrounding the case, calling it a circus that discouraged nuance. Not because he wanted Cosby protected, but because he believed truth deserved complexity. That complexity cost him. The removal of The Cosby Show from syndication hit Warner hard. Not just financially, though he admitted plainly that it took money out of his pocket, but culturally. He believed the show represented something important, an image of Black family life rooted in love, education, and stability. Its disappearance felt like erasure. He questioned why work connected to other controversial figures remained visible while The Cosby Show vanished entirely. And for a time, that loss weighed heavily on him. Eventually, his perspective shifted. A conversation with his on-screen sister reminded him that the show's impact couldn't be undone, that its influence lived on in people who had already been shaped by it. From that point forward, Warner focused less on what was taken and more on what had already been given. That mindset defined his final years. By the time he launched his podcast, Warner had fully stepped into his role as a cultural thinker. He wasn't chasing virality. He wasn't building a brand. He was asking questions about identity, survival, and the cost of being misunderstood. Which brings us back to his final days. Listening now, his last conversations feel heavier. Not ominous, just honest in a way that doesn't beg for attention. He spoke about endurance, about how simply surviving can be an act of excellence, about being the reason someone else smiles even when you can't. Within 48 hours of sharing those reflections, he was gone. Authorities later confirmed his death as accidental drowning. An autopsy ruled accidental asphyxia by submersion. Friends, family, and fans mourned. Tributes poured in, some loud, some quiet. His mother later shared that she took comfort in believing he did not suffer in his final moments. And yet, something lingers. Not conspiracy, not accusation, just a question. Why does this loss feel different? Why does it feel like a voice was just beginning to sharpen when it was taken away? Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't live loudly. He lived deliberately. He chose growth over spectacle, depth over noise. And in doing so, he left behind something more powerful than controversy or fame. He left behind reflection. And that may be the part we're only now beginning to hear. What makes Malcolm-Jamal Warner's death linger in the public consciousness isn't mystery, it's contrast. Contrast between who he was becoming and how abruptly that journey ended. Contrast between the noise of celebrity culture and the quiet way he chose to live. Contrast between how much he gave to the culture and how softly the culture seemed to respond when he was gone. In an industry built on reinvention, Warner never reinvented himself loudly. He evolved, and that distinction matters. As the years passed, he didn't chase relevance. He cultivated meaning. While others leveraged nostalgia, he resisted being trapped by it. He showed up consistently, working across television, film, music, and spoken word, not to dominate headlines, but to stay honest to himself. Shows like Malcolm and Eddie allowed him to explore comedy without repeating Theo. Later roles on Major Crimes, Suits, The Resident, and American Crime Story proved his dramatic range. None of these performances were about reclaiming stardom. They were about craftsmanship. That same intention shaped his creative voice outside acting. His spoken word work carried weight without theatrics. It addressed incarceration, displacement, racial memory, and cultural erasure, not from a place of outrage, but from lived understanding. Warner didn't perform anger, he articulated reflection. And that approach made his work quieter, but also deeper. It's easy to overlook voices like that in a media landscape addicted to extremes. By the time Warner launched his podcast, he had fully embraced the role of facilitator rather than authority. He wasn't there to lecture. He invited conversation. He listened as much as he spoke. Guests weren't there to validate him. They challenged him. That was intentional. In one of his final episodes, a simple interruption forced him to reconsider the title of his own show. Rather than dismiss it, he leaned in. He questioned himself. He allowed his perspective to evolve in real time. That moment captured who he had become. Someone unafraid to revise his thinking publicly, without defensiveness. That kind of vulnerability is rare, especially for men who grew up famous, especially for black men, whose public images are often flattened into stereotypes, either sanitized or sensationalized. Warner refused both. He didn't perform respectability, and he didn't exploit struggle. He occupied a middle ground that demanded patience from the audience. Patience isn't something modern media rewards, which may explain why, after his death, the response felt muted in certain spaces. There were tributes, yes, messages from peers, memories shared. But for someone who helped define an era of television, the industry response felt restrained. No sweeping retrospectives, no primetime memorials, no urgent reckoning with what he represented. That silence didn't go unnoticed. For fans revisiting his work, especially his final conversations, a pattern began to feel familiar. Not conspiratorial, just culturally consistent. Again and again, when black public figures step beyond performance and begin speaking with clarity about systems, identity, ownership, and erasure, the space around them tightens. Sometimes the cost is backlash, sometimes isolation, sometimes something more final. Warner never claimed persecution. He didn't frame himself as a victim, but he was clearly aware of the terrain. He understood how narratives are shaped, who benefits from certain stories being told and others being buried. He spoke openly about how black contributions are often absorbed into American culture without credit, while black lives are reduced to narrow archetypes. He challenged the idea that excellence must look like success, arguing instead that survival itself, endurance in the face of systemic pressure, is a form of excellence rarely acknowledged. Those ideas weren't new, but coming from him, they carried a different weight, because he had lived the full arc. He had seen what it meant to be celebrated, and what it meant to be quietly sidelined. He had experienced mentorship and betrayal, cultural elevation and cultural erasure. He knew how quickly admiration could turn into absence. That awareness didn't make him bitter, it made him careful, which is why his personal life remained guarded to the end. Only after his death did the public learn that he was a husband and father. He had chosen never to name his wife or daughter publicly, believing that intimacy should exist beyond consumption. In a rare interview shortly before his death, he spoke about meeting his wife not as a fairy tale, but as clarity. No rush, no performance, just recognition. When you know, he said. After his passing, his widow stepped forward with a tribute that revealed more about Warner than any headline ever could. She spoke of his laughter, his emotional presence, his commitment to nurturing inner worlds, especially for children. Together, they had been building something rooted in care rather than legacy. That detail matters, because it reframes how we understand his final years. Warner wasn't winding down. He wasn't retreating. He was planting, investing in conversations, family, and community work that wouldn't peak immediately, but would last. His foundation, launched posthumously, reflects that vision. Not grand gestures, but sustained care. Seen through that lens, his death feels especially cruel. Not mysterious, but mistimed. A life interrupted not at its loudest, but at its most focused. And perhaps that's why so many people feel unsettled revisiting his final words. Not because they predict anything, but because they reveal intention. He was clear about what mattered to him, clear about the stories he wanted to tell, clear about the damage done when narratives flatten complex lives into marketable symbols. He wasn't finished, and that unfinished quality is what lingers. Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't leave behind scandal. He didn't leave behind chaos. He left behind questions, asked calmly, thoughtfully, without urgency. Questions about identity, about survival, about who gets remembered and how. Questions we're only now beginning to sit with. Say next when you're ready, and I'll deliver the final section, including the strong, natural CTA and an engagement question that keeps the conversation alive.